There you go.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody, for coming here, especially those of you who had to brave 294 or 94 from the south. I understand that it was a serious time commitment to be here today, and I appreciate it. We are going to be on a very tight schedule today because we have to get Jeff on a plane at O'Hare on time. And yes, everybody's laughing because they understand what that means. So we have to be done by 2 p.m. Run the time in that way. So don't be offended. We need to be efficient. I would like to just quickly draw your attention to a couple of things that you received. You have a copy of the book. You also have this envelope. Please, if you haven't opened it, open it and take a look at it. This event today is the first in our series of a new type of professional development session called Connecting to Practice. It's to help us better use the opportunities that we have for learning. Sometimes we go to events, we hear speakers, we talk to smart people, and in the moment we're very captivated by it, but then when we go back to our workplace, we don't do anything with it. We go back to the same thinking that we've always done. And so we are trying to share the tools that we use within our division at the agency to help others connect the things that we experience to our practice, advancing equity for Illinois students and families. So you have that. This is a sample of what we're using at those workshops. You also have some guiding questions today to help you think through, what does this have to do with what I do every day with students at my job? You don't have to turn them in or anything like that, but it's just to help guide your thinking. We are offering professional development units or CEUs or the various and sundry other things that you professionally get. If that applies to you, just stop by and see us at the registration desk at the end of this event. There's a small survey that you need to turn in, and then you have a brochure that explains our Connecting to Practice series. And now I would like to introduce Lonnie Stonich from FAN, the Family Action Network. Lonnie is like your favorite band. Like, you want people to know them, but you don't want too many people to know them because you still want to have access. This is how I feel about Lonnie and about the Family Action Network. I have been at ISAC for 23 years, and we have never had a better partner than we do in Lonnie in the Family Action Network. So I am so grateful that she is here.
That's on tape.
And it's totally true. And I mean, for those of you who've known me for a very long time, you know that I always say my goal is world domination, and I feel like I finally found a mentor in Lonnie. Anyway, Lonnie will introduce our guest today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I love the partnership with Isaac. Jackie is such a powerhouse, and Matt, they're just incredible human beings. I love the partnership. It's been great to see you have such statewide impact across so many students and schools, and it's just right in a sweet spot with fans. So thanks for taking the time today to come here from someone that we very much admire here in FAN, and I know Jackie is also a big fan of Jeff Cohen. I don't think I have to really do too many. I'll tell you a little bit about FAN. We're a nonprofit organization. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary last year. All of our programming is free and open to the public, both on Zoom and in person. We don't charge admission at any of our events. We record, with very few exceptions, we record everything we do. We have a YouTube channel that you can go browse. There's about 350 programs on our YouTube channel, so plenty of content. The quick note on it, we do human development across the lifespan. So that's a big bucket that I like putting a lot of things in that bucket. It's a great organization, we're glad, and we hope to welcome you again soon. So I'm in charge of introducing these two wonderful people. I just met Lynn. Many of you probably know Lynn. I have exactly one sentence about Lynn. I'm going to presuppose she's a good human being because she's sitting here right now.
Well, you never know.
Just because my part of me that runs events makes me slightly anxious. There are 3 empty seats here, people sitting on the wall, 2 hours with stuff in your lap. That's hard. 3, and there's a seat right here. We actually hosted a researcher. I'm not going to remember who. Maybe Jeff knows, because Jeff knows every researcher. Sit front row. Test scores go up 6%. Front row. He's harmless, brilliant but harmless. Lynn Baker is the Managing Director of Communication Marketing here with Isaac. I'm sure many of you know her and appreciate her work. Lynn, thanks for sitting in conversation with Jeff Cohen, who we love. We first hosted Jeff back in 2022 when his book Belonging, which you're clutching in your hands right now, first came out. He did a Zoom event with us. He did an event with Beverly Daniel Tatum that was just brilliant and is on that same YouTube channel that I referenced earlier if you want to go check that out. Jeff is a professor of psychology and the James G. March Professor of Organizational Studies and Education and Business at Stanford. He's the author of the book that you're holding. It's about the causes and consequences of a sense of belonging in school, work, politics, healthcare, other arenas of social life. His research examines processes that shape people's sense of belonging and self and the implications for social problems. He studies the big and small threats to belonging and self-integrity that people encounter and strategies to include more inclusive spaces for people. Hold, please. It's on the fold. There we go, it is me. For people from all walks of life. He believes that the development of psychological theory is facilitated not only by descriptive and observational research, but by theory-driven interventions. You'll hear a lot about those WISE interventions in just a few minutes. My pleasure to welcome both Lynn and Jeff.
So we're not going to use these big mics, and I think most of you know that I can project louder than most of you want to hear. And so we'll try to project. If for some reason you aren't hearing us, we'll move to these. So just let us know. The other thing I will mention is if I happen to turn away from you, I realized I am not facing the clock to keep track of the time. So it's not that I'm not fascinated by what you're saying,
I appreciate that.
but I will try to keep track of the time. So first of all, thank you so much for coming here. I know you did a whole evening last night. And if you get really bored of talking about this, we can just talk about Bruce Springsteen.
Oh,
So,
perfect.
whatever
That's
you want to
from
do.
my home state.
Yes.
But no, I'm delighted to be here.
A New Jersey guy.
I'm a New Jersey guy.
Did not go?
It's-
Did not know that.
Yeah.
But I will start with questions about your book, since
Oh, okay.
that's why you're here.
Sure.
So with everything that is happening
Yeah.
today on this planet, which is, for many of us doesn't feel good, and for some of us feels absolutely really frightening, you've written a book about what maybe it's a deceptively simple concept
Yeah.
of belonging. So what was it that was sort of the catalyst to writing this book?
Well, there are many things going on today, right? Many problems throughout the world. Pandemic, war, racism, systemic exclusion. Hate crimes are up. Loneliness, about a quarter of Americans are lonely, like kind of chronically feeling disconnected from the rest of humanity. And our institutions, our connections to our institutions like work and church have been crumbling. So it seems that there is, on the whole, what Pete Buttigieg called a crisis of belonging. I actually just lifted that term from him. Of course, there's many lenses to apply to where we are today in the world, many ways, many angles on what's going on in this chaotic era. But I think one useful angle is this notion that if we can improve our connections, strengthen our connections, even just in the small pockets of social life, and do a little bit better, each of us, we can maybe make a dent on the problems and make the world a little bit better. And I've been doing this work in psychology for a really long time with many collaborators. I'm really more of a curator of this work. I've worked with a lot of people, especially a person named Claude Steele, who did a lot of seminal research in this area. So one of the things that inspired me to write this book is the work, the science, which I have found particularly useful. I mean, not just as a scientist, but as a father, I find the perspective useful about the little things we can do to make life a little bit better, to bring out each other's best. I found it useful as a mentor of my students. And I do believe that this science is a science of hope. It really shows the potential underlying every situation that most of the time we miss. But if we can kind of be a little bit more aware and a little bit wiser, a little bit can go a long way, I think. And we'll get into some of those examples.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly feels like right now it's up to us at this moment in time, right? Can you just define belonging, though, for all of us who might not have read the book and sort of.
Yeah, sure. Belonging is the sense of mattering to a group. It's always situated with a group. Could it be your community, family, workplace, school? It's the sense of being accepted, of being connected with it. You matter to the group, and the group matters to you. It's kind of a two-way street. You can kind of look at it as a sort of psychological assessment of the goodness of fit between me and this place. And it's always kind of the question of belonging in one's family or one's community or workplace is often just being visited and revisited. It's never quite settled. But when we have it, it's a very precious psychological state. I know, like, at an ideal level, you feel belonging when you feel fully accepted for who you are. And we sometimes get that in our relationships, maybe in our family. In a workplace or a community, out and about in our daily lives, I think that, that's an ideal. But generally speaking, what we really want is for people to feel like, Vichy Marguerite said this, like, protected from the possibility of humiliation and rejection and exclusion, right? And we can at least aim for that. The work suggests that connection, that sense of goodness of fit, is very important to health, performance, well-being. A sense of belonging is a kind of precondition for success, not just a consequence of it. But in addition, the research also suggests that what we really, really appreciate is when belonging is withdrawn, when we feel excluded. And just as an example of this, there's some awesome research by investigator Kip Williams, Matt Lieberman, and many others where they just put people in this like really kind of minimalist situation of exclusion. You play a video game online and you're playing catch with several other avatars in a little video game. The avatars, you don't even know who they are. And actually, they're just pre-programmed entities, and you're just kind of passing a ball around on the screen. And then all of a sudden, 2 minutes in to the situation, they stop throwing you the ball. So it's like a minimalist exclusion. And so what is the effect of that? In a word, pain. When people are put in the scanner, an MRI scanner, and they look at what's going on in the central nervous system, they find that the same regions associated with physical pain are activated in that situation relative to a control group. Exclusion hurts, and it makes sense because we have evolved as a species to go through this life together. It's even wired into our DNA, so much so that these minimalist exclusions, when we experience them, they do hurt. And so if we can kind of create communities and workplaces where we're kind of freed a little bit from the burden of anticipating rejection, exclusion, unfairness, that would help a lot.
So I wasn't going to ask this question until much later, but now that you've talked about exclusion and us and them, I do want to sort of ask you about the relationship between trust and belonging, because, and you use Rwanda as an example, or you talk about Rwanda in your book, and I'm very fascinated by that because I've had the pleasure of talking to some psychologists from Rwanda, and for those, just as a reminder, there was a huge genocide in Rwanda where the Hutus killed about 800,000 Tutsis in about 100 days.
Yeah.
And these have been their neighbors and colleagues and friends. And there have been massive reconciliation efforts that I think have been, fairly effective. But I think about it, we've all been on the in and out, right? In school, we've been in the in group and then suddenly the out group at work, in our social lives.
Yeah.
How do you rebuild those connections? Because you talk about the pain that comes from that kind of exclusion.
Slowly.
Yeah.
Slowly. One answer to your question, because there's many different answers, but I think one useful question is that the way you create reconciliation and recreate trust or build trust isn't through persuasion or information campaigns. This kind of comes out of research in social psychology. This is like a really big lesson. We think that we really have to change people's attitudes, change their hearts and minds, and then their behavior will follow. But the research really underscores this lesson. Change behavior first, even in baby steps, and hearts and minds follow. And that's a big lesson, and I think we really don't understand that. So many of our approaches in schools for example, are based on kind of information campaigns, telling kids about risk, trying to persuade people to be nice and charitable and altruistic and saintly. But really what works is getting people to come together cooperatively in pursuit of what social psychologists call superordinate goals. Like this is some goal, some higher purpose that we can only achieve together in a structured situation where we're working together, at least a little bit. And that can be very helpful. And so a lot of the research underscores the power of that approach in creating trust and breaking down prejudice. This is sort of goes back to a lot of old research in the social sciences. Basically, you create a situation where I see myself interacting in amicable ways across lines of difference, and then I kind of revise my attitudes about the outgroup, revise my level of trust about them in light of my actions. So some examples of that are sports, right? Salma Musa did this awesome study in Iraq, trying to bring, long story short, I'm going to just simplify, Muslims and Christians together. And all she did was, to create a situation of cooperation for superordinate goals, integrated sports teams, following the example of actually Nelson Mandela and apartheid with rugby, I think it was. And she found that creating integrated teams where Muslims and Christians worked together, played together, had this huge impact on the players' trust of one another, and then even the degree to which they interacted across lines of difference, across this sort of fault line after the sports league was over. They were much more likely to practice with the outgroup, members of the outgroup afterwards, and even kind of to stand up for them and actively recruit them and actively try to bring them into settings such as their family or their community where they were often ostracized. That's an approach that really works, kind of creating these kind of opportunities for people to kind of work together in even small ways. Cooperation in pursuit of superordinate goals. It could happen in the context of sports. It could happen in, I used to work as a camp counselor. And whenever two kids were fighting, I wouldn't try to persuade them. What I would do is get them to work together. Clean up the bathroom together. That works. That stuff works. You get people to kind of work amicably together and hearts and minds follow.
So I think what you're talking about and what you talk about in the book a lot, right, is situation crafting. And I think that's what's so kind of refreshing about this book is you give a lot of really practical tools that we can use to do this kind of situation crafting. But I think what's so interesting is this idea that we're sort of acknowledging the situation rather than the cult of personality. And I wonder if you can talk about that, situation versus changing somebody's personality.
Yeah, the lesson in social psychology is change situations, not people. Of course, what's inside a person, their virtues, their morality, etc., their character, that does matter. But what we really underestimate in this culture is the power of context, the situation that people are contending with. And there's a lot of research to make this point. One of my favorite examples is this awesome study by Lee Ross, where he's just looking at, I think the ordinary young adults coming in to play one of these strategic economic games where you can either sort of do what's called defect, grab the pot of money for yourself, kind of follow kind of the self-interested, greedy path, or you can cooperate with your adversary and try to work together to share an even potentially larger pot of money. But that takes a little bit of trust. Anyway, they asked people, what would predict whether people defect or cooperate in this little game? And people generally say, if the person's like a greedy SOB, that's really going to matter. Or if they're kind of saintly and altruistic and nice, that's really going to matter. What they find in this study is that hardly matters at all. The person's reputation among their peers as greedy or nice, that doesn't predict their behavior. You know what does? The name of the game. When you call this game the Wall Street game, 70% of people defect. They take the greedy path. When you call it the community game, a little shift in the situation, 70% of people cooperate. It totally flips. The name of the game. I find this study so interesting. I'm still kind of pondering it, but I think it's very empowering because it suggests that in little ways, like in our interactions with students, in our interactions with friends and neighbors, just down about every day in all kinds of walks of life, we can We can make the situation into more of a community game through the words we say and the actions we do, right? And you change the game, then people start to identify, okay, what it means to be a good person in a situation is to be kind and empathic. And we can all do a little of that. So it's all, situation crafting is all about the power of the situation and the ability each of us has in the situations that we experience to change them a little bit for the better. One way I look at this is power of the situation. Social psychology is about the power of the context over the power of the individual, but it kind of circles back, right? The opposite of great truth is also true. That applies to the situation. The person can also be powerful. The person can be powerful by changing the situation in small, dexterous, and wise ways. And let me just give one example. So one example that my colleagues, Claude Steele, Lee Ross, and I did, we're looking at how can you craft the feedback interaction to go a little bit better. And we were looking at 7th grade teachers. These were white teachers working with students of color, where there often is a kind of little bit of a fault line of mistrust because students of color may just wonder because of negative stereotypes about their group if the teacher is evaluating them in a fair way or might be potentially biased. There's a bit of a kind of barrier of mistrust in that situation. And we looked at what the teacher might do to make the feedback, the constructive criticism, so important for learning, more impactful, more trustworthy. So students got criticism on their essay, about 2 pages from their teacher. And then for one group of students, the teacher wrote a little note preceding the criticism. And that note said, I'm giving you this critical feedback because I have high standards and I believe in your potential to reach them. It was a sort of crafting of the feedback interaction, crafting the situation. So now, from the point of view of the student, all of a sudden the criticism is kind of flipped in its meaning. Now I'm thinking, oh, its critical nature is actually an affirmation of the person's belief in me and that they're not applying the stereotype. What we found is that for those students who just got the control criticism, like just the ordinary criticism that they typically got from their teacher with whatever positive feedback the teacher accompanied with, 17% revised their essay. But for those who got this little note before the criticism, 71% of students revised their essay. Trusting the situation, feeling like they were fully seen, they could kind of engage with the learning opportunity. That's an example of situation crafting. One of the tragedies, I think, of social life is we often don't see the impact of our actions over the long term. Like we might do harm, we might do good, and we often, most of the time, we don't even know. In this study, we could actually track the effects of that note. And what we found, this is with David Jager, what we found was that over time, those kids who got that note, that expression of belief in their potential, 60% made it to a 4-year college years later, compared with students in the control note, getting the control note, only 40%. That one word of affirmation at a key moment, this is 7th grade, where a lot of students take a turn for the worse, made a big difference in their trajectory. And I find this so hopeful because it suggests, yeah, maybe a little ways down on the ground. I'm not saying the note will always do this trick or that the note is a solution to all that ails us. Absolutely not. Structural reform is so important. But in the right time, in the right place, for the right person, a little bit of support, the right support can make a big difference. And so it's very promising, very hopeful, this idea of situation crafting. Very hopeful.
Let me ask you about
Yeah.
leaders and gatekeepers,
Yeah.
since we've talked about teachers and we might talk about it at work too. So what about when we've got an authority figure or a gatekeeper that might not share the salient identity with maybe the staff they're working with or the students they're working with, and might not share the experience of perhaps of minoritization? How do we bridge that gap? How does a leader bridge that gap and build empathy? I think one of the examples is really the research you just talked about.
Yeah. I mean, this is work from Claude Steele and others that, we live in a kind of unprecedentedly diverse society, and the challenge of a lot of integrated institutions is to kind of navigate that diversity, to kind of build trust and a sense of belonging. And the dynamics of the situation are such that can be pretty hard. Like in that feedback study that I mentioned, it makes sense for a person to wonder if they're sort of widely stereotyped, or they know that there are these stereotypes that are out there in the world about my group. It makes sense to kind of just wonder, okay, could I be seen through the lens of the stereotype? Or am I being seen with a full measure of dignity? And a lot of times it's just kind of ambiguous. So situation crafting is one answer to your question, which is you kind of are just kind of aware a bit of the kind of rivers of the currents of the situation, and adjusting the situation a little bit to create some trust. And it could be through creating superordinate goals. It could be through the wise criticism, where you're aware that the stereotype is in play, but you say something or do something to disabuse the person of the possibility in their minds that the stereotype's in play. This is what's known as wise intervention. And this term wise actually refers to, it was a term coined by the sociologist Irving Goffman, and he actually borrowed it from the gay subculture of the 1950s. It just, at the time, it referred among gays to straight individuals who they knew would see them with dignity. And this term wise intervention is exactly kind of means that. It's about conveying dignity in the situation. And little acts like giving criticism with an acknowledgement of high standards and an explicit belief of the person's potential to reach them is kind of a wise act. It helps the person to feel believed in, And there's many other examples of this kind of sort of situation crafting or wise intervention that can kind of reassure people that I am being fully seen here and believed in. One other example is what's known as values affirmations. And these are wise interventions that help people to feel seen. And these have been developed in a lot of different lines of research. They boil down to little opportunities we create in situations with other people for them to reflect on their values and say what they really care about. So a lot of time the values affirmations take the form of these little writing assignments that we will give to students or kids or adults, where the writing assignment first asks you to identify your most important values. What are your most important values? The things that you really, really care about. Might be creativity, might be relationships. And then after identifying their most important values, people then write about, why is that value important to you? And what we found in several different lines of studies is that little act of taking some time to reflect on your values, it kind of gives people a sort of psychological equanimity to cope with a threatening situation. So we found, for example, with middle school students and college students, that completing that values affirmation activity improved their retention, so that 7th grade students were more likely, especially 7th grade minority students and low-income students, were more likely, after doing 2 or 3 of those writing assignments in the 7th grade, they were more likely to graduate from high school and make it to college. And in some subsequent work, we found that even at the college level, college freshmen who did that activity, these were Black and Latino students who completed that activity, they earned a higher GPA if they did that activity when they soon entered after the transition to college. If they did that little writing activity a couple times, they earned a higher GPA than their peers in a control group who didn't write about values. So wise criticism is a way to say, I believe in you. Values affirmation is a way to say, I'm interested in you. I see you. And some nice work by Eric Smith suggests that when teachers ask their kids about their values, such as giving them these sort of values affirmation activities, the kids feel, oh, my teacher cares about my whole self. They're interested in me as a person. And little things like that, there's a kind of suite of other things, can convey that message pretty powerfully. So that's one answer. I think kind of being I think it's about being wise to the situation, knowing that, it's kind of a skill set to be aware of the diversity, what diversity does, what integration does, the kind of complexities and the ambiguities it introduces, and trying to navigate them. And there's many other examples of this, but those are just 2. Just one thing I like to emphasize actually at the outset, I didn't get a chance to do that, is that what is paramount here, I really believe, is structural reform. Like, the best way to to really feel like I belong in an institution is whether I kind of come to the workplace or come to a school and I see other people like me here. Is this place a kind of diversified institution? Are there people like me in positions of leadership? And I think there's a lot of work we can do as institutions to really move that ball forward. And that is paramount. Cracking down on discrimination and bias in hiring and promotion, for example, is just one. And we can talk about strategies for doing that. But structural reform is paramount. These strategies that I'm talking about now, really kind of expressing a belief in students' potential, for example, or people's potential, affirming values, they're how you deal with the hand you've been dealt down on the ground. Because every day in every situation, we kind of have to deal with the situation before us. And how can you address it in a way? How can you navigate the situation in a way that helps people to feel like they belong?
So I have so many follow-up questions to this, but one of them is related to, one of the things I thought was, I think, very validated in reading this book, and I know you talked to Jackie Moreno about, and I think you might have heard about our ISAC Corps and the work that our outreach work, which I think a lot of the work that is done is actually, it's nice to see that some of those, I think we're using some of those WISE interventions in a lot of the work that we do as near-peer mentors, working with high school students, very often first generation and low-income high school students, and helping them transition to college. And I imagine, in a sense, there's the stories that we use of like sharing stories of, our near-peer mentors, many of them are first-gen college students themselves, and so they share those. And I think there is some values affirmation that goes on as well. And I'm interested in your research. I know you did some research with low-income college students, and I'm interested in that because I think we align in many ways here.
Yeah. Well, two things. One is mentoring works. I mean, if I had to put my chips on one strategy, it's mentoring. Mentoring really does work. One of the big predictors of whether college students, including low-income students, when they graduate, they go on to a career that they find fulfilling and satisfying, and they're kind of successful and thriving, is whether they say, I found a mentor during college who really helped me to feel like I belong and like I could do it and like I had something to contribute. So mentoring really does work. And creating mentoring programs, even light touch mentoring programs, the research suggests that's like one real powerful way to nurture belonging, especially including for people who are kind of trying to navigate a really difficult situation where they might feel like where they might be underrepresented. Having that little connection. James Jones kind of showed that a lot of, for example, ethnic minority students on college campuses, they kind of find these oases of belonging by nurturing a relationship with another, for example, Black or Latino faculty, right? Finding someone who's like them, or another faculty member who came from who was a first generation college student, is kind of creates a little sort of oasis of belonging or affirmation in an otherwise pretty threatening institution. He finds that this is predictive of thriving and belonging among students. So that's one thing. Mentoring works. Number two, the mentoring needs to be structured. And or it's much more effective if it's structured. If mentors are kind of trained in how to do it. And here I'm thinking of this great work by Buju Dasgupta, where she introduced a mentoring program, a peer-to-peer mentoring program, where senior female science majors, STEM majors, mentored incoming female students who were thinking about majoring in STEM. And the mentors, though, were trained. She didn't just say, go mentor these students. They were given some strategies. And one of the key strategies that she gave them was to share their stories of adversity. So talk about the transition and how it was difficult, and how you navigated it. And what this does, and a lot of research suggests this, is it normalizes adversity. So and I remember this as a grad student when and one of my mentors said, I was struggling a bit. One of my mentors told me, when I was in grad school, I thought of dropping out a few times. I was like, really? And all of a sudden I feel like, okay, this is kind of, it doesn't say something, my struggles don't say something that aren't unique to me. And that's very powerful. And so that's what she did in these mentoring programs, is she trained the mentors in sharing stories of adversity. And she found that mentoring program increased the percentage, this is just a new study that just came out, increased the percentage of incoming female majors who continued through STEM by roughly 15 raw percentage points. Even though they met only like 3 to 4 hours for their first year of college, years later, these students were more likely to have stuck with STEM. So a mentor, even these light touch mentoring programs, when they're really well structured, can make a big difference for people who are underrepresented, for low income students, especially for any group where they feel like, maybe I don't belong here. That kind of program can really be very helpful to answer that question for people in the affirmative.
Let me ask a question about that, because this actually just occurred to me, but we have diversity programs are under attack, our DEIA programs, DEIA training is under attack everywhere. And I wonder, what can we do to make them impactful? Is there something in those stories of adversity, in the values affirmation exercises, that can make them sort of less threatening to folks, rather, who are maybe having to sort of address stereotypes for the first time, and oftentimes people feel they're on the defensive, but also to actually make them impactful into the future and not kind of check the box programs?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. There's different answers. I would do a call out for Jessie Smith's work, where she has these DEI programs at universities, mostly focused in her work on improving STEM retention, but Jessie Smith. And what she does is she brings people together in small groups to work together on DEI efforts. And she has this whole process of doing this. She recruits people from various departments in STEM. For instance, she's focused here on the gender gap in faculty hiring in STEM. She brings men and women from the department together. They share stories. So women share stories. When I started my professorship, when I was just interviewing here, here's what someone said that really was like a little bit of a microaggression. It really kind of hurt me and made me feel like I didn't belong. And then people start to get it. So sharing stories is one powerful way to kind of bridge these divides. And people start to understand. They don't understand. People do not respond to arguments and facts very much, but when they hear a story, that really resonates. I hear the pain of what it's like to be excluded or discriminated against, or for someone to make an offhanded comment that really makes me feel like, I think that in this case it was a female faculty member recalling how when she was interviewed, one of the other professors there said, well, what's your husband going to do when you're here to support you? And she's like, why are you even bringing this up? And she just described how that experience was really impactful to her. Then people kind of open up, and then they kind of she builds these sort of small cooperative groups. That's the second thing. So sharing stories. The second thing is creating small cooperative groups in pursuit of the superordinate goal together. So men and women, people of different groups working together in pursuit of this goal of equity and diversity. She does sort of present facts, too, to the faculty members, because a lot of people will just say, it's just the supply. There's not enough talented women coming into STEM. And then she'll present, well, here's what other universities are doing, and they don't seem to be having this problem. So she has those facts, but they're accompanied with stories, and she brings people together to work cooperatively. And then the third thing she does is to give people these little sort of behavioral strategies to increase diversity and equity. If you're interested in finding talent, here's where you look. And if you want to reach out, here are some letters that you can use to inquire about potential candidates. And here's how you word your job search ads, the job ads, to be inclusive, inviting of people from different backgrounds. And she provides them with this sort of arsenal of strategies. And so that combination of things, small groups working together, sharing stories, given concrete behavioral strategies to increase equity, that really works. She found, I think it was before implementing that program, I think the percentage of female faculty, I think was about 30%. After, I think this was about 10 years later, that university achieved parity, gender parity in STEM representation in their faculty. So I really do believe that change is possible. I think these DEI, I'm so upset that DEI is under such siege now. So that's a whole other issue, but I do think that this kind of idea of situation crafting, creating the conditions for success for any endeavor or for groups of individuals, I really think it applies to so many things, including our efforts at improving diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So let me ask you about facts and also about us and them, right? So and I'm sure you get this question a lot because we live in a world of disinformation now, more so than ever, and we all sort of seek confirmation bias, as you talk about, and there are in the media. There's lots of tools to discern the difference between fact and fiction. Like there's the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. There's all these tools, but my sense is that a lot of people don't use them because, as you say, we all think we're objective.
Yeah.
Like we don't need them. So we don't use that. So when you have sort of this illusion of objectivity and you have confirmation bias and then you have algorithms in social media that actually just compound the problem and create these echo chambers, it's kind of this recipe for that divisiveness. So how do we get ahead of that? How do we get people thinking critically, and how do we get people talking to each other and wanting to discern what's fact from fiction in this planet?
One answer is through crafting situations where people can kind of A, become aware of their biases, and B, kind of have their minds binded so that they aren't led down a bias path. So what you're kind of talking about a few things here. The objectivity illusion, it refers to this phenomenon in social psychology, a kind of bias blind spot. We think that we see the world as it objectively is. And what that does is it makes us oblivious to our own bias. Because we know that, so much science suggests that what's behind the eyes is a kind of mental construction. And you shouldn't necessarily trust your thoughts. It's like I saw this bumper sticker. Don't believe everything you think, right? Just because I think it doesn't make it true. But if you think you're objective, you're not going to think that. You're going to think, oh, my thoughts reflect exactly what reality is. And that's a big problem for nurturing belonging, because people end up holding stereotypes, for example, and they think that they don't. They're unaware of their own biases. They think when they read the media that agrees with their opinion that it must be right because I agree with it. And actually we find in a number of different studies, this is work with Eric Ullman and Michael Schwabe, we find in a number of different studies that the big predictor of bias, both in discrimination and in susceptibility to fake news, is your perception that you or your side is objective. The more objective you think you or your side is, the more biased you are. And people seem to just kind of have this attitude or this heuristic of, if I think it, it must be true. So that's the objectivity illusion. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with it? Well, one way is to just be aware of your capacity for bias. As the theoretical physicist Richard Feynman once said, he was talking about science, being a good scientist, he said, the first principle is don't fool yourself. And you are the easiest person to fool. And I really think that applies to mental life too. Just being aware that I am capable of thinking and acting in ways that are biased. And that awareness of your capacity for bias is a big antidote. So those people in those studies that I mentioned, the ones who don't discriminate as much are the people who think, yeah, I could be potentially biased. So humility, this is all about the utility of humility. Here's another example of a bit of sort of situation crafting that you can do. Once I'm aware of the capacity for bias in me or my organization or my group, I can take steps to ameliorate it. And here's one example. In one line of research, we found that, to make a long story short, when people were hiring male and female job candidates for the position, for the job of police chief, they revised their criteria to fit the credentials of the male candidate. So if the male candidate had street smarts, people would say, oh, you know what's really important for being a police chief is street smarts. But if the male candidate had like book smarts, a lot of education, administrative skills, and people say, oh, you know what's really important for the job of police chief is book smarts. So they kind of retrofitted their criteria to the credentials of the man. And so as a result of that, people ended up thinking that they hired the right man for the job when in fact they chose the right criteria for the man. They kind of got it backwards. And the people who did that the most were the people who really believed in their own objectivity. So given that, if you know that this is a possibility, what you could do is introduce some situation crafting. Let's kind of bind people's minds so they don't go down that path. And we found that a simple intervention did just that. Have people commit to their criteria, the job criteria, before cracking open the job candidate files. And that eliminated gender discrimination in our studies. And that tactic has sort of spread throughout the nation. It's like a little bit of situation crafting that you can do, that you would do if you're aware of the potential for bias in yourself or your group or your organization. Little things you can do. And another example of this, one of my favorites is from Jack Davidio, where he introduced an intervention in the Army to reduce racial discrimination in promotion rates. And all he did was to tell the people who were responsible for hiring two things. One, monitor for racial disparities in promotion rates. Just monitor it, that's it. And number two, if there are any racial disparities in promotion rates, explain why. And sort of introduce a little accountability. It's like a little kind of conservative solution maybe to a liberal problem. And what it does, it kind of gets you out of your skull. So you're kind of thinking, oh, why? How do I justify this racial imbalance in promotion rates if they occur? And it gets people to just monitoring their decision-making, the cumulative impact of their decision-making over time, because we don't do that enough. And he found that that little intervention eliminated discrimination in promotion rates in the military. What doesn't work is just telling people, be fair, be objective. That does not work. We know from work by Emilia Castilla. It's not enough to just try to change people's attitudes towards it. A lot of times people have good intentions, but their kind of minds just play tricks on them. And so you need to have these little strategies that help people bind their minds from going down a darker path than they want.
So we also deal with not just this sort of objectivity illusion, but also this sense of indifference right now, right? And I think you talk about stereotypes sort of engender this indifference. How do we find each other's humanity, and how do we address that? I think there's lots of reasons for this sort of indifference at this moment, but tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, I'll say what a lot of academics don't say enough of is, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But here's a few ideas. I think there's three challenges. One is for, bridging this indifference, like the Elie Wiesel idea that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference, and indifference is the epitome of evil. That's really interesting. So how do we kind of open our minds so that we can really see the humanity and dignity of each other and not be blinded by our stereotypes? It's a really difficult problem. I don't know the answer, but there's a few strategies, a few challenges that we can rise to. One is the challenge of communication. Communication, what's known as sort of perspective getting, taking the time to ask people, what's your circumstance here? How's it like for you? Like in the workplace or a school environment? Tell me more. What are the barriers to your success? There's work by Nick Epley that suggests we just don't communicate enough, especially across lines of difference. We don't take the time to ask. Even in our relationships, he finds that we really overestimate our ability to read other people and think we know their preferences. We get it so wrong. He finds that even in married couples, when they're trying to guess, oh, do they want to go on a camping trip or not? They don't even bother to ask me. They think they can read that person's mind, and they have to get it wrong. What he finds that works to get people to be more empathically accurate is perspective getting, taking the time to ask people about their perspective. So that's one solution. Perspective getting. And there's some amazing research maybe we can get to later showing that really works in schools. Ask low-income first-gen students, hey, what are the barriers to your success here? They'll tell you two things. In fact, I really want more faculty engagement. I want tips on how to get better. Give them that, and they really excel. So perspective getting is one way to kind of bridge this indifference, understanding people's circumstances. The second, I would say, is the challenge of humility. The challenge of humility, which we've talked about. Don't overestimate your, don't have hubris about your mind. We talk about critical thinking, like being critical of media, but actually just be critical of your own mind, right? And the examples that I was talking about, conquering the objectivity illusion is about understanding that, just because I think something doesn't make it true. Just because and I think judgment is so toxic here, it really kind of distances us from other people. It distances ourselves from other people. And so many of our judgments are about us, not the person that we're seeing. One example of this is a wonderful study on actually anti-Semitism by Fine and Spencer. I'll make a long story short, where they find that when you threaten people and make them feel like insecure, right? They take a test and they do badly, they engage in more anti-Semitism. They're less likely to hire a Jewish job candidate than an identically credentialed Catholic candidate. So their judgment is actually tainted by their own insecurities. But if you affirm them, have them remind themselves of something that they care about, that they derive importance from, a value that they hold, then anti-Semitism goes away. So I think knowing about those kinds of findings gives us a bit of humility and maybe makes us more likely to tend to our head space and our heart space so that we're more charitable in our attributions of others, overcoming this sort of fundamental attribution error. So that's the challenge of communication, perspective getting, and the challenge of the challenge of empathy, right? Knowing that we can't, the challenge of humility, knowing that we can't trust our own minds, and the third is the challenge of empathy. And how do we really kind of, we can never fully understand another person's point of view, right? But how can we get there a little bit? And here I think that the research on sharing stories is just so powerful. I think there's some lovely research by David Brookman and Josh Kalla, where, again, long story short, but the bottom line is they have canvassers go door to door in various districts and have conversations across partisan lines. So it might be in a conservative voting district, a canvasser has a discussion with a conservative voter about transgender issues. And they're trying to get the voter to kind of be a little more empathic about transgender issues. Or it might be immigration too, but undocumented immigrants, helping them to kind of have a little more empathy. What we know doesn't work is just bombarding people with facts and information about the issue. We know that doesn't work. But what does work is sharing stories. Sharing stories. And so, as part of these conversations, they last just 10 minutes, the canvasser asks the voter one question. For instance, in the context of transgender rights, the canvasser says, being treated unfairly, we know hurts. Can you think of a time when you were treated unfairly because of something about you that you couldn't change? And then the voters kind of open up, and as I recall, one of the voters recalled how he got PTSD as a result of fighting in Iraq, and he came back, he couldn't find a job because he had PTSD. People wouldn't give him a chance. He's like, now I kind of get the emotional dimension of this experience of being transgender and having your rights encroached upon and being humiliated, but possibly being humiliated. They started to kind of get it in the heart. And what they find in a number of studies is that really leads to enduring change on these issues, that people become much more empathic. It's through sharing stories that resonate with the heart that people can kind of create empathy. So I would say these three challenges are ones that we can all work on. I mean, I know, I try to work on them. These lessons are so easy to say, harder to understand and harder to live by, for sure, for sure. And that's kind of why, I think this research is so important. They're like little practices, like a practice. They're beautifully simple, but hard to apply, right? The challenge of humility, challenge of communication, and challenge of empathy. Something that we can all work on.
So I know we're drawing to the point where we're going to go into Q&A, but I have one more question for you. But I do want to sort of remind folks that there is you have this great key takeaways section in the back of your book that sort of lists those and summarizes them in a really great way. And also on your website, you've got some great values affirmation.
That's true.
Exercises.
I do have the values affirmation exercises on my website.
And how to use them. So I think those are really fantastic.
Thank you.
Last question, and I know you've gotten this question before because I've watched some of the others, but I think it's a question we all kind of have to ask, which is, these seem to be really effective interventions. And should we scale them? How do we scale them? I raise this because, interestingly, in the Illinois General Assembly, there is now a bill that would require that school districts provide instruction on relaxation activities such as yoga or meditation once a week for 20 minutes, in addition to recess, to enhance physical and emotional health.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, should we legislate interventions? Can we? Would that even be effective? What do you think?
I mean, there for sure are certain things we should legislate. I don't think wise interventions are one of them.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, for a couple reasons. But one in particular. Every single one of these so-called interventions, I actually don't like the term intervention. Because it's got to be real. It's got to be authentic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what we're talking about here is taking an authentic interest in and really believing, having that faith in another person. That's why I'm saying you can reach a higher standard. And really being interested in a person's heart. That's why I'm asking you about your values. And really being interested in supporting another human being. That's why I'm sharing stories of adversity. I don't quite like the term intervention, but I know I've used it. But it's about being real, right? But being real may not be enough. You also need a little strategy here. It's like having good manners, right? Saying please and thank you. It's a protocol, but it's very helpful. So strategies are very helpful, but strategies are not the solution. It's got to be kind of authentic and not enforced. And so that's why I don't think they should be enforced, because really it's not about the intervention at the end. It's about the principle. It's about conveying that message. I see you. And there's many ways to do that. It's about conveying that message. I believe in you. And there's many ways to do that. And it's about conveying that message. I got you. And there's many ways to do that too. And I don't think those are the kinds of things that you can legislate.
We just have to model the behavior.
Yes, I think we have to model the behavior, and it's got to be the choice each of us makes.
Yeah.
But we can support each other in making that choice, creating situations that I think in the end what a lot of this is about is creating the conditions so that people can draw their own conclusions. And hopefully they're the conclusions that will all make us better individually and as a collective. But you can't kind of enforce beliefs or strategies of this kind, I think. You can support them, you can advocate for them, you say, I think it's a good idea, you can sanction them, but really in the end, it's about what you believe in your own perspective and prism.
Well, I really want to thank you for this conversation. I know we've got a ton of questions that people want to ask.
Thank you.
What we're going to do is we're going to take a 10-minute break to give Jeff a break from talking and let him get some water and maybe eat. You all are welcome. There's still plenty of food left. But like I said, we're on an extremely tight get to O'Hare before a tornado schedule. So please.
I'll leave you to the tornado.
Yes. Please be back and seated at 1:10. It's 1:02. Okay?
Thanks so much.
From the audience, I'll be over here, Tommy's over there, and if you just want to raise your hand with a question, we'll come around to you. Don't be shy.
Thank you again for a wonderful conversation. In your book, you had a section where you talked about raw talent and mixing that with the situation. And you referred to Einstein, and it brilliant as he was, but as a social situation, his wife was a physicist as well. Is there a way to kind of look at how much is raw talent and how much is situation? Is there any way to really parse that out in some way? And does it even matter necessarily?
Yeah, people have tried. I don't think you can. But people have tried. I think 2 points. One is that we really overestimate the importance of so-called raw ability. It's the case that some test scores do predict later outcomes, but not by much. Here's my favorite example. There was just a study out where they were looking at whether like high intelligence, like high IQ, at some point, if you have too much of it, it's predictive of bad outcomes, right? But they kind of measured IQ scores throughout the country, tens of thousands or over 10,000 students, and then they predicted from their IQ scores later career success. And the way you can measure this is like, okay, well, ask how much of the diversity in outcomes, variance in outcomes, do IQ scores predict? And most people would think, maybe 80% of the difference in career destination, 70%. Actually, it was only about 8%. We vastly, I mean, I think people way overestimate the importance of whatever it is, intelligence, smarts, whatever, or even at least our ability to measure. I don't even know what that is. But so I do think we have a kind of fetish for testing in our country, especially in education, a fetish, which is really just problematic because we spend way too much money on testing people and way too little money on creating the conditions for their success, right? And we do that way too much in so many other spheres, like trying to pick the right person for the job in the interview. It doesn't work. Interviews are not predictive. Trying to predict the right people for relationships or for collaboration. It's true that there is some kind of sorting and that you want to do, but it turns out that we would be better advised to create the conditions for our choices to work than to actually try to make the best possible choice. And so I think that's one point. And then the second point is I'm kind of thinking aloud here that it's not so much the person or the situation. I don't think you can really parse it that much. It's the dance between the person and the situation. It's a dance, right? You get the kid interacting with a great teacher, and the teacher reinforces them. Like a kid starts to perform a little bit better, right? And then their performance is seen by the teacher, and then the teacher responds back, and you get this kind of interaction loop going. And I think we know this from relationships. There's something called Michelangelo effect, where over time people become more and more their ideal self. And that happens because they feel mutually affirmed and seen by one another. And that kind of creates this sort of comfort zone where people feel okay taking risks and trying to rise to a higher standard. And that's about a dance between me, who I am, and my partner responding back, and then I becoming more of my ideal self. And I just think so much of life is a dance between people, dance between the person and the social situation. And I think we really underappreciate that. And that's why I think it's so important for people, for instance, to, go find niches where their talents and their assets, whatever they be, are seen and reinforced and rewarded.
My question relates to, I believe that we're shaped by our values, our backgrounds, our orientations, our experiences. So in fostering belonging within our teams, divisions, and our organization, how can we do a better job of accepting, those differences? Because that's really what makes us diverse.
Yeah.
Right? So that we can foster teamwork for the, greater mission and vision of the agency. So just speak to, how we can harness those differences, is my point, as a strength to ensure that we work as a team while still relating, not just tolerating or accepting, but identifying that those differences are there for the goal of the organization as a whole.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, and there's so many answers. I'll give one point of view from the science. I think this idea of transformational leadership really kind of speaks to me, but I think we're all kind of leaders every day in like little ways, kind of setting these little micro norms. But transformational leadership is about leading with values, saying, this is why I believe it. I really believe in inclusion, for example, and the power of diversity, and that our differences are a source of strength. So a leader can do that. It doesn't have to be the manager. It could be any one of us, right? And research suggests that that's really pretty impactful. There's work by Nicole Stevenson where she finds that even just giving incoming students from underrepresented groups a mission statement from their university that acknowledges the importance of diversity from the top down, that improves their GPA relative to the control group. Just that little acknowledgement of these are our values here. And then second, it's not enough just to talk the talk, you have to walk the walk. So that's part of what transformational leadership is about. So you create moments where you see that value realized in action. And one of the best examples of this is some work by Sherry Wu, W-U, over at UCLA, where she's looking at kind of inclusive democratic management. And she does these amazing little studies where she goes into various workplaces. She does this all over the place, in China, United States. And the intervention is pretty simple. The manager in one group just does business as usual, meets with the group of employees. It could be at a factory, say, and just kind of gives them the agenda for the week. For another group, the manager takes a kind of hands-off approach, but they're not kind of laissez-faire. They ask questions like, hey, what should be our goals this week? Here's what we're dealing with in management, but what do you think? And can do you all have some kind of ideas for how to reach these goals and tips to share with one another? And these conversations last, at the beginning of the week, they last about 20 minutes, that's it. And she finds, I believe it's about a 25% increase in productivity among employees as a result of those little democratic conversations where people see democracy and inclusion practiced in action. And I love that work because it just shows, well, how do you do this? And it doesn't take much. It's about asking really good questions and trying to kind of integrate the perspectives and act on the perspectives of the various group members. And she also finds, this is so interesting, she finds that in China, the people who go through that their support for democratic values and egalitarian ideas goes up as a result of just enacting those ideas in practice at work. So I would say that it's about really being explicit about what our values are and then creating these small pockets where we can, see those values in action. It's transformational leadership, but we can all do it in little ways and big ways.
As you were speaking, a theme that came up, or from what I heard, was curiosity.
Yeah.
And seemingly so, it seems that we've lost some of that curiosity. So I'm curious if you think, what do you think has contributed to that loss of art of curiosity, culturally and within our society, that may keep us from connecting with one another?
Do you think we've lost curiosity? I'm just curious. Same one. You might be right. I'm just curious. It's such an interesting question.
I don't think we've lost it.
Yeah.
I don't think at least in my work, I've seen a lot of emphasis on curiosity. Yeah.
You see a lot of emphasis on curiosity in your work.
I don't think.
Yeah.
I see it a lot.
Huh. That's so interesting. Curiosity is a really powerful motivator. And here I'm just totally thinking aloud, like powerful. They find even like it's almost like we come into this world very, very curious creatures. One of my favorite examples is if you just hide an object from a little toddler, they're like, where'd it go? It's like, they're really curious, right? It kind of activates, it's energizing. No, I think that we don't have enough curiosity. I think you're right. I mean, on the other hand, I see a lot of my students today, they're really curious, but it's about maybe being comfortable with uncertainty. And maybe that's hard to do now if people are worried about judgment and looking dumb. You kind of have to be safe. You have to feel safe to have that curiosity. It's a psychological challenge. And I think belonging really helps here for nurturing curiosity. I think it does. I think it's an interesting empirical question, but I'm thinking that, here's a great example. there's that old research, it really kind of stuck with me, by Mary Ainsworth, where what she does is she puts people in these little strange situations, kids, like little toddlers, I think they're 5 years old, and it's a strange situation, it's unfamiliar. And there's like toys all around and strange objects, and she brings the kids in with their caregiver, usually their mother in the era when this research was done, and she looks at what the toddler does. Are they curious? Do they go out and explore this little world or not? And some of the kids, they stay kind of hunkered down next to their caregiver, and some of the kids go wander out, they look around, and then they start to manipulate the objects. They're really curious about the world, they challenge themselves. And what predicts curiosity in that study, whether you kind of wander off and venture forth, is the quality of your bond with your caregiver. More of a bond. Because you would think, maybe if you have a better bond, you're going to stay close. But actually, you have a better bond. It's like a sort of psychological perch. It's like, this will be okay, and I'll be safe. And that kind of helps cultivate curiosity. And I think it's true too with adults. I think we did that. Greg Walton and I have a social belonging intervention that where we share stories of adversity with incoming first year college students, and it just helps them to feel like they're not alone in their adversity, and that it'll get better. And one of the findings from that research is that when they go through that experience of just knowing, okay, I do belong here. It's not, my struggles aren't unique to me or my group. They're more open to intellectual challenge. So they select more challenging courses to take rather than gut courses in a kind of decision task we give them. So I don't know. I think that, this is kind of riffing aloud, but I think that's part of it. And I just think we need more wonder too. I think the way we teach, there's something about the way we teach, and I do this too. It's like, present it. It's like, oh, I have all the answers here. But, the variance unexplained in so much of our science is huge, right? What we know, what's that William James quote, what we know is a drop, what we don't know is an ocean. And kind of making that clear in our education of our kids. It's like, maybe even our management, like, this is really, reality is really ambiguous. It's like, I don't know what's going on most of the time, and it's kind of wondrous, and we can kind of work together to figure it out. And kind of giving more of that idea, spraying more of that idea in our teaching would be, that's another answer.
So when we're dealing with refugees, newcomers, migrants, asylees, parolees, what kind of strategies would you suggest for our nonprofit to further the mission of what we call bridging the hearts and minds of all people?
Yeah. I got a study for you. Here's one. I really like this one. It's by Christine Bauer and Greg Walton, and you can tell me if this resonates. But what they do is they're looking at, I believe, refugees coming into Europe and helping them to integrate both in school and the larger society. And they share stories from former refugees who've kind of integrated and thrived in their new country. But what they do in this activity is to present stories that frame what might otherwise be a threatened identity as an asset. So coming in as you might think, like it can be stigmatized, but actually you have a kind of source of strength coming here as a refugee and a perspective that's very useful to other people in your school, for instance. And having come from a really difficult circumstance, you have a lot of grit and a lot of ability to kind of navigate challenging circumstances. There's like a lot of other things that just shifts the frame on the so-called threatened identity, shifting it from a perceived liability to an asset. And they've done this with refugees, but they've also done it with actually people who are dealing with depression as well, in a few other contexts where you're taking what might otherwise be a threatened identity and flipping it. And they find these really positive effects, so that just, for example, in one study, the refugee students are more likely to take more courses in their first year of community college when they enter Europe. It's not called community college, it's called something else. And they have a greater sense of belonging. So that's one example, kind of sharing. It's one thing I should emphasize is that it's the stories when we do these kind of interventions are always a little bit curated to kind of emphasize a few key themes. So it's almost like you only have like one shot with any experience. And you got to think, what is the idea that I want to convey? And it's probably usually one idea that you can convey in any one experience. So in that study, it's this idea that what you think is a threat is actually, what you think is a liability is actually an asset. In the other studies that I mentioned, the social belonging intervention, it's that if you're experiencing difficulty, hey, guess what? You're not alone. And we all do. And it gets better. And here's some tips for it getting better. It's not just like, here's a bunch of stories. The stories are kind of curated and distilled to emphasize some key themes. And one other thing I left out that I think is important is not just hearing the stories, it's reflecting on them. So we have people, when we give them the stories, and sometimes we even accompany them with survey statistics from, more, for instance, senior students who've gone through it, or anyone who's gone through it. We ask people for, what did the stories mean to you? How is it true? How is it true for you that the college experience has been difficult? How might this be true for you? And why do you think this is true? Why do you think things might get better? And how do you think that the ideas that you read about in the story, how do they resonate in your own life? So it turns out that reflection, in addition to sharing stories, is really a kind of key component here. You have to kind of help people to make the ideas their own. So it's not just I'm reading the stories, it's I'm putting the ideas in my own words and turning them into my own story, right? So I often think that when I and other researchers are presenting this research, we give the what, right? This is the intervention, but we don't give the how as much as we should. And the how is just as important as the what. How do you kind of accomplish these things? In addition to sharing stories, what's really important is getting people to actively reflect on the ideas and make them their own.
Do you mind just explaining just the significance of the umbrella?
Oh, I really appreciate that. No one ever asked about that. And people are always like, why is it an umbrella? The idea is just, even when there's a storm, we can kind of create a little shelter, right? And it can be a little fun even under the umbrella. I think it just kind of captures this idea that we live in a difficult time, and there are many strong forces of division at work here in our culture and because of our history. And they're kind of raining down on us. But yet, it's almost like this little superpower we have in our day-to-day interactions. We can kind of open a little umbrella and say, this doesn't apply here. It's like that wise criticism study I talked about. Hey, stereotypes not work. I know there's stereotypes at work out there, but right here between you and me, no. And that can be really powerful, I think. So that's a metaphor of the umbrella. It's like we can kind of create a little zone of protection, maybe, but even fun. I try to, it's going to be fun to be under the umbrella too, together. So I kind of like this idea of play, right? A little space. Anyway, that's the idea. That's the idea. Like these little shelters, safe spaces, protective spaces that we can create together in our day-to-day interaction, no matter how bad things get. I really like these, here I'm just kind of riffing a little bit, but these little Alexander Payne movies, do you ever see these? Like the Holdovers and Sideways, right? And they're all about this, like kind of a bunch of misfits and outsiders, like we're in this bad situation. We've all been left behind for winter break at this, this prep school, but we can make a kind of amazing world together. That's why. That's why.
I'm curious about, I think you talked a little bit in the book about caring and how caring is important.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if caring, like in situations where maybe a college counselor is working with 150 students to one counselor, I'm just curious about caring and whether caring needs to be, can be conveyed or nurtured in situations where resources are stretched thin, and kind of the reality of situations like that.
Yeah, I think so. I guess two things. None of us are saying that it's all about psychology, about that feeling of personal concern and caring. That's certainly important. But also resources are important. Opportunity, material opportunity is important. So the formula here is it's sort of psychology plus resources equals success. And I think psychology is kind of like the missing link. Like there might be resources here, but if I don't feel comfortable, I'm not going to avail myself of those resources. If I don't feel cared for and seen, I might not take advantage of an opportunity. Like I'm thinking of a story I heard about a first gen student who was taking a course and couldn't afford the books for the course, the textbooks for the course. So he didn't get the textbooks, he didn't do the reading. But if he only reached out and asked the professor, he would have found out that he could borrow the books from the library. But he didn't have that comfort, that sense of safety to ask for help. So that's the idea. Is that there's a kind of synergy between the two. You need both. You need both. Either one alone won't quite cut it, I think. And a lot of times I think we experience this where we're kind of giving people opportunities and giving them a lot of feedback, and it just doesn't seem to be working. But a lot of these things, like again, like the wise criticism idea, I believe in you, in your ability to reach a high standard. So there's like that sort of straw off the camel's back, right? And all of a sudden, the opportunity activates. Okay, so nevertheless, in spite of all that, I think there is a way in which feeling cared for, even a little bit, can go a long way. And I think the studies that I talked about maybe show that. In a difficult circumstance, feeling seen. Thinking, we did some work with the Other Side Academy. This is like a long story short, where people are coming out of prison and trying to kind of make a better life for themselves. And a lot of these people are coming from really, really traumatic backgrounds. And trust is really a big issue because they've been betrayed so much. So how do you rebuild trust for these individuals? And the answer is through that relationship, a caring relationship. By establishing a caring, trusting relationship with, say, a big brother at the academy, people can kind of rewrite their theory of people. They can rewrite their theory of people and start to kind of feel a little more trusting, and that helps people to put themselves out there a little bit more and maybe pursue an opportunity that they might have otherwise rejected. I think, though, it takes time. It can take time. The greater the disadvantage, the kind of more the uphill battle. But I think one of the lessons here is that caring is a long game, and you kind of have to hang in there. And what people read, I think, is, are they there consistently over time? And that can be a pretty powerful thing when it happens.
Question. So a lot of us are from ISAC, a state agency. So as a state agency, we have a lot of rules, regulations, process, things we have to do. We have about 250 employees. About 70 to 80 of those are what we call our ISAC core. They're recent college graduates. They serve on basically a 2-year program to help students and families navigate the path to college. They're deployed all over the state. The rest of our agency, we have employees who have been here 40 plus years, a lot of long-term employees. So my question is, how, as an agency, are there things you think we could do to create a better sense of belonging, to improve our sense of belonging for people that come and join the agency, to maximize how they help people, to stay with the agency as long-term employees where that makes sense, but would really look for any advice you have for us as ISAC, a state agency.
Yeah, I to be honest, I don't know. I never feel comfortable advising on any specific circumstance unless I know more. So it's like perspective getting. I just love to learn more. I think I could be more helpful, like knowing more about the circumstances, the barriers, any problems that you're seeing. Usually when we work with organizations, we do a kind of a map of the situation. And we survey people to kind of find out what their experience is like and maybe where we lose people. So given that, I would say that the best thing you could do is is perspective getting. Ask people. Be really systematic. Like, what was that onboarding process like for you? How much do you feel like you belong? Was there anything we left out? Was this message that we were trying to convey that that resonate with you. And you could do it with a small sample or with focus groups or interviews. You can even find out from people who left, like, why did you leave? What was it? A lot of people leave organizations. It's one of the top reasons people leave is they feel unappreciated. So in a lot of organizations, one of the solutions is to help people feel appreciated and practice gratitude. And that turns out to be really important because we don't do nearly enough of that. And so I would say that perspective getting is really important. Oftentimes what's just so important is for people to feel recognized and seen. I've talked to people who've left companies because they were like, I contribute so much to this presentation, and then I wasn't even acknowledged in the presentation. You just like that kind of thing. That really adds up. So preventing those sorts of things is really important. But I don't know what goes on here. A bunch of perspective, even a little perspective taking can get perspective getting, asking people rather than trying to take their perspective, getting their perspective turns out to be, one of the best things that you can do. And going back to that other study that I mentioned, where they just simply asked first-gen students, what are the barriers to your success here? And then they implemented intervention based on that with more faculty contact, more tips for doing well, just introduced through emails that had this whopping effect. So I guess I would just say that. I know it may not be incredibly helpful, but it's one of those things that is obvious but so useful. Some of the most obvious things, the most common sense things are not so common, as my father used to say.
Thank you. Jeff, I have one last question for you, and it's practical and a little bit personal for, I think, a lot of us in the room and maybe for you. But, yesterday I was there at your event at Stevenson, and, I was there when you got in, and you get off of a plane, you come to a place you've never been to, you're swarmed by people everywhere, moving you around, wanting to talk to you, and then you have to get on stage and appear comfortable. And a lot of people in this room are currently near-peer mentors or were near-peer mentors, but all of us in some way work in college access, and because we're the agents or the representative of an agency, we go to places where we try to make students feel comfortable and parents feel comfortable, but often we do not feel comfortable, which could make us seem off-putting.
Yeah.
And how do you deal with that?
Yeah. I certainly have my off days for sure, and it's often the energy of the place that you kind of feed off. Again, it's this interaction between person and situation. So like this crowd, this energy just feels good. It makes me feel at home. Makes me feel like I belong, and I think that's helpful for one. But I would say one thing, which is just remind yourself of why you're here. Like, what is the purpose? Why are you doing this? And I think that I find that very helpful. It's a kind of little values affirmation, right? I kind of go in and it's like, this really isn't about me, right? It's about something bigger. And if that I feel like it kind of roots you a little bit, even in a very stressful situation. It's like, okay, this is about, just doing the best I can, spreading the wisdom I know, and trying to make a little difference. And, I'll just play my role, and that's all I can do. And so I do try to remind myself of those kind of higher purposes, like what are my values? What are my values going in? And I do feel like, that can be very grounding. And also, it doesn't even have to be about my purpose here. It could be about my kind of other things that give me a sense of value and belonging, like my family, my kids, my relationships, like that. And then this becomes like, I can kind of be a little bit at ease. I'm not going to, as my daughter tells me, you're not going to learn anything. When you give a presentation, she has this attitude, I'm not going to learn anything about myself here. I'm not going to learn it. It's because I'm grounded by other things. So I think that's helpful. And I'll just give you one example of this. Shannon Brady did a little study looking at first-year teachers working with adolescent kids. These were largely students of color. And the research finds that a lot of, and mostly white teachers, and a lot of white teachers have anxiety, of course, and a lot of stress their first year of teaching. It can be really, really stressful, but that can be especially acute in situations of diversity where a lot of teachers, like a lot of people, might worry about coming across as racist. It's like a little tripwire in the situation. And that work suggests can really undermine the quality of instruction. Ken Harbour finds that white teachers give too much positive feedback in their interaction with black kids because they just don't want to come across as racist, so thereby depriving minority kids of real critical feedback from which they could learn. So what Shannon did was to have the teachers complete 2 values affirmation writing activities at the beginning of the school year before they, right when they started their job, and then 2 months into it as these kind of key pressure points. And she found that judged by outside raters, the quality of instruction was better at the end of the year for those teachers who had done those sort of value reminders, value affirmations at the beginning of the year, compared with teachers who did not in a control group. So that's like one little thing. I think that kind of grounds you. I found that so useful. And then you could have like little things on your phone, pictures, to remind yourself of these things. I think that's, that kind of stuff makes a difference. That kind of stuff makes a difference. And of course, also just talking with people who've been there, done that, and getting their advice. That's always useful.
I want to thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone who came here today. I know a lot of fan events are in the evening, and this is during the day. And so I know that this took a lot for you to get here today, and Deerfield's in the middle of nowhere. Certainly, not near our students that we work with usually. So I appreciate everyone being here today. You do not need to rush off. You're just not allowed to talk to Jeff. But you can stay and eat and talk and chit chat. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.